Good afternoon. I'm Earl Butch Graves Jr., President and CEO of Black Enterprise. It is my privilege to welcome you to the Black Enterprise Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Summit, Part 2. Due to your overwhelming response to our first ever DEI event in February 2021, in which we examined the proposed metamorphosis of corporate commitment to real change, as well as presented actionable steps to resolve systemic inequities, we now unveil Part 2 to deepen the conversation in our powerful one-day agenda. Over the past 18 months, we have watched corporate America respond to the emergence of COVID-19, ultra-partisan political division, and the aftermath of the George Floyd tragedy. There's been an unprecedented focus to adopt and bolster diversity, equity, and inclusion as corporate values and targeted goals. This summit is about how to take those items on mission statements, put them into practice, and ensure they are intentional, measurable, and transformative. This dialogue is timely and extremely valuable. Although we have witnessed the announced financial commitments towards addressing social justice and economic equity, the current workplace and investment in Black-owned businesses do not measure up or reflect our nation's rich diversity. Black employment still falls far short at every level within corporate America. For example, African Americans comprise 13.4% of the US population, yet continue to make up only 8% of white-collar professionals. Even more abysmal is our representation in senior leadership roles. Black executives occupy only 3.2% of these positions at the nation's largest publicly traded companies, and a completely disgraceful 0.8% of all CEO positions. That's why Black Enterprise, the #1 Black digital media brand in the country with more than 8 million monthly unique visitors, is committed to holding corporate America accountable. Through our important roundtable discussions, we are dedicated to answering a range of critical questions to amplify the importance of corporate America delivering on their equity pledge. To address these issues, we have assembled a cadre of high-powered executives and thought leaders to discuss Black representation and engagement in this era of corporate renewal. One part progress report, one part strategic plan, and one part call to action. Today's event has been designed to meet the urgency of our times. Before we get started, I would like to extend my appreciation to our sponsors, Toyota, American Express, Boeing, Merck, and Wells Fargo, for their understanding of the value of such dialogue and making an investment in this exclusive first-class virtual summit. Moreover, I want to thank all of you, our audience, for joining us for this dynamic event on today's rapidly changing landscape. To kick off our event, I will engage in a fireside chat with two of the most foremost leaders in corporate America discuss the heart of this issue, equity. We can hold expansive conversations about the merits of diversity and inclusion, but what are companies really doing to elevate Black people fairly and purposely in all segments of corporate America? In our exclusive candid conversation, aptly titled, Courageous Conversations That Make Equity the Priority for Corporate America, we are joined by Carla Harris, Morgan Stanley's Vice Chairman and Managing Director, and one of the top female executives on Wall Street, and Michael Hyter, President and CEO of the Executive Leadership Council, the preeminent global organization focused on developing Black corporate C-suite and board leaders. Carla and Michael, welcome to the Black Enterprise Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Summit.
Thanks for having us, Butch.
Thanks for having us. It's a pleasure to be here, Butch.
Absolutely. So I want to jump right into it. And I want to focus on, there's been a lot of talk on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's all kinds of, every organization now has DEI this and DEI that, and they've thrown this word equity into diversity and inclusion. But I think they've thrown equity in because I think it's a nice word, but it doesn't really address what I think is the challenge, right? The challenge of the word diversity is oftentimes diversity becomes a diversion from Black, and you can catch up any other type of group you want to have with diversity, and then you've thrown in military, white women, Hispanics, gay and lesbian, you name it, it gets thrown into the diversity, bouillabaisse, if you will. And Blacks are putting to that. And so suddenly this diversity bouillabaisse can look really nice. You can say, well, we have 38% diverse, whatever, depending upon how you define diverse. Inclusive is a little bit like being invited to a party, but yet there's velvet ropes for the people that are inside, but you're inside the party, you can see it going on, but you're not really included inside the velvet ropes. So would love for each of you to, from your perspective, define equity as you see it aligning to corporate America and what role that it has in the DE&I equation.
Well, I'll go ahead and get started, Mike, if that's okay.
That's absolutely fine.
Okay, all righty. So I think equity is an important word, and I got to tell you, I don't think it got thrown in there, Butch, as a nice to have. I think those who were supposed to benefit from diversity efforts, then diversity and inclusion efforts, as they were invited to the table to have the conversation, pointed out that, yeah, we have this diversity program, we have this inclusion program, but at the end of the day, am I getting paid what X person was getting paid, or am I having an opportunity to get this promotion or that promotion? So I think equity came into being as the conversation evolved, and as those who were a part of the conversation started calling the thing. And equity is clearly important because it is one thing to have people within the organization, but if there is an awareness, and let's face it, Butch, there's always an awareness because people talk, information leaks, that, there's a disparity around pay, or people see someone elevated or promoted, that those who are within the organization say, wow, well, why wasn't that Butch? Because he's this, he's that. And then there's no real understanding around that. And it happens not only to Butch, but it happens to Michael and it happens to Carla. Then it's not a Butch specific issue. Then people start to feel that it's an environmental issue, if you will. So I think equity is key if organizations want to have long-term, sustainable, and competitive drives around diversity and inclusion. You have to have the equity because people need to see representation at all levels, especially millennials and Zers. And I want to make this distinction right here, Butch, because those of us who are boomers and older Xers understood that we were going to be the first and the only in many rooms. That's just the way it was. Because, in corporate America, when I walked out of Harvard Business School in 1987 and you behind me in 88 or 89, excellence in corporate America looked like 6 white men at the top. That's what it looked like. There was no Pickett, IBM, Goldman Sachs, Ford, Morgan Stanley, Procter & Gamble, Pickett. That's just what it looked like. So we knew we had to be comfortable being the first and the only in many rooms. But that's not the environment that millennials and Zers, who, by the way, are now the dominant population in the workforce, they've grown up in a different environment where they've seen women lead, and they have gone to great schools where there's a smart Black kid on the left, smart Hispanic kid on the right, smart Indian kid in front of them, smart Asian kid behind them. That's what excellence looks like. And if they don't see it, they won't go. And if they go, they won't stay. And it will compromise any company's objective to be the employer of choice. So equity is key if you're going to bother to have any kind of diversity and inclusion effort. Sorry, Mike, I was trying to tighten it up.
No.
That was great, Carla. Thank you. Michael, what's your...
Butch, when Carla speaks, markets move. So we let her take her time and share what she has to say. I'm going to build on that for a second, because I think to Carla's point, it wasn't a sort of a casual word that was thrown in between two words. However, the origin of why it was even added had a lot to do with the perception that with diversity and inclusion dominating the conversation for years, the results didn't seem to bear any fruit relative to those conversations. And my own, I guess, the thing that I am cautious about is organizations' tendency to use words as a way of glossing over the work they need to do to make results happen. So I think equity is a legitimate, it's fair access to opportunity. It's fair access to opportunity. Diversity, we're all different. Inclusion, having the power to have a decision and to be included in conversation. But equity is about opportunity, and it is outcomes oriented intentionally.
Mm-hmm.
But people are using it as a buzzword. I've seen people use DEI as a way of trying to impress the three of us that they are in line with what that means, but there's no track record of them ever having done it, you know? So I had a conversation with a CEO recently who won't be named, who asked the question of me in, you know, after a couple of drinks and dinner, and we were comfortable, and he said, can you give me a sense of how many are too many? Like, you know, what's the number? If I, you know, with respect to my board, I have 12 people on the board, you know, how many Blacks would be too many? And I said, the fact that the question was even asked would suggest that there is an oversimplification around lack of understanding about what Black excellence and quality means, as opposed to being focused on numbers. No one ever asked that question about white males, ever. You know, how many is too many? And so when I think about equity, I want to reinforce, that's why I'm really happy that you're facilitating the conversation centered in this, is that equity is fair access and what people need in order for access to be allowed. And we're all different. So that might mean different things for different people to have the same outcome. And that's, I think, what trips people up, because a lot of times people will think equity means, well, I'll say, leaders who aren't of color may assume equity means favoritism or remedial support for somebody, as opposed to what do we need to do better to be able to give people access to opportunities other people are benefiting from, and to be deliberate about it. So that's what it means to me.
Yes, let me build on that, or take what you just talked about in regards to the, I want to come back to you, Mike, on the conversation you had with the CEO, but I want to take that and pivot it a little bit to the board, or boards of directors. And Carla, you know, I've known you for a long period of time, and you sat on corporate boards and are currently sitting on a major corporate board. The view inside a corporate boardroom is different than from the outside, right? And I'll also point out that in 2020, as measured by us, and all Black Enterprise does is take public information and make it more public, right? When people say, why did you call them out? All I did is take the public information and make it more public. There's only, of the 500 largest companies by market cap, only 300 of them have an African American today currently sitting on a board. We can't unpack all of that, but I'm going to attempt to have you answer this question, Carl, in regards to what is the conversation inside the boardroom around the equity conversation, right? Because I'm sure in many of the places, the boards that you walk through, or companies you walk into, on their board as you walk on the board, or in the lobby as you walk through, they have all the things, the mission statements and the things that they stand for. And diversity is generally one of them. But what about the conversation on equity? How do you address it as a board member? And what are the other folks, the white folks sitting in the room, how are they responding to this whole thing of equity?
Mm-hmm. You know, I will answer, you know, not just in the capacity of being a board member, but also in the capacity of somebody who serves boards, all right, as a service provider, as a banker. Right. And I will tell you that the conversation around equity has certainly taken steam, Butch, in the last, I'm going to say, 18 months, and certainly in the last year. And I think companies are not just looking at who's on the board or who they have in senior positions. But I do think it is about positions, and it's also about compensation and making sure that there's not an inequity around, how people are currently compensated. They're starting to look at, their promotion processes and what are they taking into account, how those processes work. And I couldn't agree more with Mike than with the fact that equity is about access to opportunity. And one of the things that I've been saying as a service provider, to boards and to senior managements as well, is that you definitely need to, quote, check the house, as I like to say it, and understand the processes that you have for elevating people and for giving out those key assignments, because often, Butch, that is where the sneaky little unconscious bias is sitting. And that's where a lot of the inequity is produced. And I'm going to give you a quick example. Financial services for decades, there's been such a thing as an assignments associate, if you will, that gives out assignments. Well, it's no secret that people sort of say that the Wharton undergrads have better analytical and quantitative skills than the Harvard undergrads and the Princeton undergrads, for example. And so when there's a big M&A deal that comes in that's high profile, that's going to need a complex merger model, someone says, the MD says to the assignments associate, I want Michael. That's the kid that came from Wharton, and I understand he's really great. He's a monster with models. So Mike gets the first deal. And then there's another one that comes right behind it 2 months later, and that same MD is on it. He goes, I had Mike last time. Mike's my guy. Mike's going to be the one. Now, meanwhile, Carla's there, but for those same, 2 months and then 2 months, 4 months, she's working on comparable company analysis. She's working on comparable acquisition analysis, not a big, ugly merger model where she can really hone those quantitative skills. Now, again, nobody at the top is looking at that, but that's how the process is happening on the ground. Now, fast forward 6 months, when you have an evaluative conversation between Mike and Carla, someone says, Mike, he's a monster. He's great. That kid's a superstar. Carla, good pair of hands, right? And it's only been access to the opportunity. She didn't get a chance to work on the big, ugly merger model and to really hone her skills. So frankly, as an organization, you have no idea of the talent that she might have, but you're already ranking her as a little bit behind Mike. And so again, that's where the bias is and the process. And if you don't look at those things, i.e. do an audit of what's happening in your organization, the board can't see it and they can't help you, right? And the management, the top management who's crying about diversity and equity and inclusion, they don't know it either. So you have to take an audit if you really want to try to get to equity. And I will tell you that boards and senior managements are trying to get there. And that's one of the messages as a service provider that I'm giving. And even as a board member, check the house, check the process. I trust me, you have processes in place that are creating part of this inequity that you now think is a skill differential and therefore justifies a pay differential and justifies a promotion differential. And it's about the process in-house.
Thank you, Carla. Michael, I want to ask you a slightly similar question.
Yeah.
You mentioned you had this conversation with the CEO, and it's funny because, and I'm sure all of us have experienced this, but I was doing a fireside chat like this with a Fortune 50, CEO, if you will, and we're having this conversation, and he's trying to deal with the pandemic. He says, well, the pandemic of COVID-19. I said, you got twin pandemics. I said, the pandemic of COVID-19 is one. The pandemic of racism is another. And I said, COVID-19, there will be a vaccine that will eradicate that. The racism pandemic, which is really what it is, has been going on for 400 years. And that has, for whatever reason, they have not been able to get a vaccine to clear this, to cure it. I said, now, I'm sure there's researchers, Harvard researchers are probably going through trying to figure it out, but there's no pill that solves this. So he said to me, in a sense, as short as he possibly could, he said, well, we want to do, he goes, what is it that Black people want? And It struck me, I said, damn, why he's asking, what do Black people want? But he didn't mean it like, he wanted to get, it was like a mosquito on your shoulder.
Yeah.
What do you want? Just kind of get you off. He's like, tell me what you want so I can try to figure out how we can address it. And I said,
Right.
oh, we want some really complicated stuff. We want good jobs, promotion, places for our kids to go to school, housing. We want really complicated stuff. I said, we want the same thing you have.
Yeah.
The same thing. And it started, it was like, oh, so now ELC, the organization the CEO, Mike, and you're interacting with CEOs all the time.
Yeah.
How do you get this point across without not insulting them, not trying to say that it's anything they've done bad, but honestly, it's almost like it's a blind spot. Like they don't see it. But you got to see it because it's all things, all those microaggressions, Carla, you just pointed out a second ago, right?
Right.
These microaggressions or these blind spots and things that they didn't know and that they didn't assign have an impact. It starts to, tear at the edges of Black people. How do you have that conversation? What are the conversations you're having with the CEOs that you speak to who are part of ELC?
Well, I'm happy to, and thank you. And one of the things that I often lead with is the numbers of the progress in terms of the representation. I'm going back to the numbers that you opened with, would suggest that there is a low expectation of Black ability to perform at a high level, subconsciously in the mindset of the vast majority of people who are making decisions about talent. I lead with that with the CEO because, because there's only one other, you have one or two doors to go through. 1%, less than 1% representation at the CEO would suggest that no one Black is capable of being a CEO intellectually, or the system has created headwinds at the root of how CEOs are developed that you just don't think about because the preoccupation is on fairness of treatment like you had, as opposed to what can you do deliberately to make opportunities for development available to people who are different than you are, is the conversation that I have with CEOs. And what I've been, I guess, pleasantly surprised is that there appears to be, Butch, a genuine interest in wanting to be better, but a subconscious tendency to assume everybody's experiences socially are the same. So it's almost like it's the one area people who are held accountable for every other numerical metric known to humankind aren't held to a metric around how are they maximizing the development of people who are different than they are as a basis for your strategic opportunity as an organization. I really am, and I feel passionate about this. I really think that leaders of all stripes should just be more intentional. And I know in the title of this, we're talking about courageous leadership as well. To be intentional that you want diversity, ethnic diversity, as a specific outcome, in addition to your numerical responsibilities. Now, freeze for a second. One of the things that I'm clear about is that as it relates to Black executives within companies, we are in decline at a faster rate in terms of representation at the C-suite, even though we get lumped up into the bouillabaisse, as you called it, of the numbers look great numerically because our diversity numbers have changed. You disaggregate the information and then you look at Black representation, and the closer you get to profit and loss responsibility, the smaller the percentage gets. So it's almost as if there's some subconscious assumption of inability to perform at a level that puts a person in a position of running a business that happens to be Black. So what we're trying to do is get organizations under the definition of equity to be clearer. One quick example just to wrap this up. Working with a law firm who really was frustrated with the lack of representation around Black partners. When we actually looked at what are the criteria you're looking for for people who join the firm that have potential to be partners? They could tell you clerkships, the schools they go to, the GPA they're supposed to have, and the like. And I said, okay, so let me see of the managing partners who run this organization, what percentage of the managing partners represents that standard completely? 30% of the managing partners represented that metric. I said, so if let me look at the Black associates, that one Black partner you have, and the other people who are listed Latinx against that number, 98% of them represented that standard. So there's a double standard of looking for perfection for a handful of people. But when we start to look about what are the competencies required to be successful, independent of pedigree, independent of school, what are the competencies required? Go to where the inventory of people that represent that competency that's available and give them a shot, and let's see what happens. And they broke the rules and went to 2 schools that weren't the 3 white shoe schools that they typically have gone through for 30 years. And the percentage of performance has been amazing with respect to the Black associates from these HBCUs who've been perceived as being lesser quality than some of these top 10 law schools were. When they were competencies based, they saw an uptick in productivity. And then they came to confront the fact they were pedigree, relationship, and comfort level driving in their decisions, as opposed to competency. To me, equity is being competency based when you're looking at talent to be board members or C-suite level people versus thinking everybody should look like you do or go through the same experience and background that you and I went through in order to qualify and apply.
Carl, I want to disaggregate even the conversation on Black executives or Black businesses, what have you. And I want to, when I say disaggregate, I want to bring it down another level to Black women specifically. Mm-hmm. Because as much as it has been a challenge for African Americans, for Black women, it's been a challenge even above and beyond that, right? And when I say that and how they are perhaps perceived, looked at, what have you, it's yet another layer below what they're even looking at African Americans at, and for no solid reason other than, and you'll hear this word oftentimes inside a boardroom, well, they weren't quite the right fit, right? And that's an acronym for, I have nothing in common with this person, so therefore you're suddenly not the right fit. As you know, every year we have our annual Women in Power Summit, mm-hmm. Which has grown into become an event in and of itself, but where we try to aggregate, if you will, not disaggregate, aggregate 1,500 powerful sisters to come together who are corporate executives, some entrepreneurs, some other things as well. How does it break down that someone can look at their executive ranks and never dawn on them that Black women have to be added to this equation? It's not enough to just say Black. You have to actually say Black women. And, the word, a terrible word in corporate America, no one wants to, people don't say, but they want to use multicultural, they want to use diverse. Nobody wants to use the word Black. It's like there's something wrong with the word Black. So as a Black woman, an extraordinarily successful Black woman, right? And a unapologetic Black woman, right? Proud and unapologetic Black woman. What do we have to do? How do you address this to have them intentionally look at, no, I want you to find someone who looks just like me, mm-hmm. and promote that person and give that person that opportunity? That's a loaded question, but it's important. It's a provocative question, but we got to get to it.
Yep, and it's not that loaded. And thanks a lot for describing me, because that's exactly who I am. You are right. Everybody knows that. So listen, I think one of the reasons that it hasn't happened, frankly, Butch, is that there really hasn't been sponsorship across the board for women of color in particular. And let me just go straight there, Black women. And you know as well as I do, and Michael has heard me talk about this ad nauseum, if you don't have that person behind closed doors arguing on your behalf, it is not going to happen, because when you get to those really senior levels, there is an assumption of equity. Let's go back to that word. There's an assumption of equity around performance. So we're all being considered, and people say they're all good. Well, you know as well as I do that in many cases, there's a light of day between person A and person B, but there's an assumption of that they're all good. Well, if there isn't someone in the room where that decision is being made, that's pounding the table, that says, no, it has to be Marcy this time, Marcy doesn't get it. And I think that we don't get the sponsorship that we need. So behind closed doors, and there's two reasons that I think we don't get them. Number one, you know, people are not of mind, to your point. They are not thinking, you know, well, let me see, of the 3 people that I'm sponsoring, is it a diverse group? Do I have any women? Do I have any Black women? People tend to sponsor folks who are more, that look like them and that they're more, quote, comfortable with. And if you haven't built these relationships along the way, there's not the comfort level. And nobody, not you, not me, nobody spends their currency on somebody that they do not know. So the fact that there hasn't been an effort from on high to get to know the candidate, and then let's talk about us. I'm going to own some of this as Black women. You know, trust is a hard thing for us, right? And if we have not been treated well anywhere across the board, then we're not so apt to run into those relationships either. So I'm gonna put some culpability on both sides of the equation, but certainly the organization, the senior leaders ought to have more of the responsibility and the intentionality about making sure that they have these diverse teams. And that's how it gets lost. We don't have the sponsorship. It's not about the performance. You know as well as I do, it's not about the performance unless there has been this inequity around the access to opportunity. But it's around no one is behind closed doors pounding the table, say it has to be. And you say, why don't they just think about that? Well, there hasn't been a level of accountability, Butch. At the end of the day, you know, far too long, diversity and inclusion was a nice to have. It was the right thing to do. Nobody was looking at it through the strategic and the commercial lens. And you have to believe that it's going to make a difference to your bottom line. It's going to make a difference to your ability to attract, recruit, and retain your best people across the board. And that's what CEOs need to embrace now, that millennials see it differently. And I keep going back to that because you could get away with that 20 years ago. But if you do not have Black women, other multicultural folks among your senior leadership ranks on your board, that's going to stand out. And that's going to hurt you with your ability to attract and retain. So that, if you don't believe the profit, if you don't believe the revenue, that becomes your compelling reason, because you need the people in order to prosecute the business. And you won't get the best if you do not have that as your example. Black women, other multicultural women, other women, all across your ranks.
Well said.
Yes, Michael, we have to address the fear factor and you know, I want us to go right to it because there is a fear factor, right?
Yeah.
The fear of the unknown. I do not believe that white senior executives at the top of the let's call them the named executive officers and their proxy statement, right? The top 6, whatever they may be. I don't think that you wake up in the morning and say, beautiful day outside today. How can I exclude Black people today?
Right.
They don't wake up and say, you know, I'm in the mood to exclude some people today. The problem is they don't wake up and say, how can I include and make equitable my place of work so that there are people who are different than me who are there.
Right.
And I'm going to ask you the question, but I'm going to, Carla, you'll understand this from a golf point of view. I went out to play golf about a month or two ago at the country club, and a white man walked up to me and said, you know, Butch, every time I see you here, most of the time I see you here, almost always, I always see you playing with Black people. And I wonder why. And I said, well, that's an interesting question. Because, you know, every time I see you playing here, I only see you playing with white people. And in his mind, in other words, playing with white people was the norm.
Right.
Playing with Black people was not the norm, and there was a fear. He didn't understand it. He was, not a fear of like someone's going to take his clubs, but just a fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
So how do you address the unknown, the fear factor? And Carla, you can answer this as well, but how do you address this fear factor inside your corporation, your organization, your boardroom, your country club, whatever it may be? The fear of the unknown, fear of Black, because it still doesn't make any sense. Here we are. Carla, you're 1,000% right. The millennials, I have 4 millennial children, and not children, but
yeah, I know. Same year.
Age of 30 and 26, and none of them and nor their friends would stand for the nonsense that we had to go through and experience. They just wouldn't.
Right.
But yet the numbers don't lie. The numbers still are the numbers. Here we are, in 2021, and we still have 0.8% of CEOs that are Black. Address the fear factor, if you would, and both of you can answer this question.
Well,
Michael, go ahead.
I think that things that sort of reduce fear, but I want to start with the premise that I think fear often, to your point, Butch, is not obvious to the person who's afraid. But behaviorally, they are, but they aren't carrying that in their mind at the time. But what I've seen is familiarity breeds comfort. And familiarity breeds comfort. Comfort leads to trust. And the more people are created and allowed to be in situations where we become more familiar with one another, and that's especially as it relates to, I'm talking racially, the comfort level goes up. And so that's one of the reasons why, to Carla's point about sponsorship or advocacy or allyship, where someone is introducing someone who's different and allowing that person to develop a relationship with someone that doesn't know them. Because how many times have you and Carla have heard, because I know I've heard, I know the answer, you don't have to say it out loud, but how many times it's been inferred that once they've gotten to know us, we're really smart people. Or they've gotten to know us, and we're really gifted and bright and brilliant, and the word I hate the most, articulate people. With familiarity we're less of a blank face of concern. And so the more that we're exposed, even that conversation that you had was a growth opportunity for that person, as opposed to that person never having that conversation ever, even though that might have been something that he processed when he saw other people. So I just really focus on, trying to create a degree of familiarity as an intentional act on both sides. Fear is reduced, but in the absence of that, people tend to make assumptions. And you and I are, one sweatsuit and backwards baseball cap away from being perceived differently more than white people are, relative to how that fear thing creates a sort of a dynamic in a person's brain. So this helping people become comfortable with learning and getting to know people who are different addresses fear faster than just telling them they shouldn't be fearful, in my opinion. Carla, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll have to agree with everything that you said, Mike, and I'll add something to that, which I think there's been 2 major impediments to forward motion on diversity, inclusion, and now diversity, inclusion, and equity. And it has been fear, no question about it. And it has been the lack of knowing how to do it. And when the fear has been a huge one, because it's fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of looking stupid, fear of getting sued, fear that it may impair my legacy as a leader, right? I think about leaders who are in the seat today. They say, wow, the guy before me and the guy before that and the guy before that didn't really deal with that D&I thing, not in any meaningful way, but nobody's going to tag me as a CEO if I have great revenues, great profitability, and I expand our market share and keep our costs down. But if I get this thing wrong, then that could really impair my legacy, right? So instead, let me just keep a lid on it, make sure it's okay, that it doesn't go backwards, but that I don't really try to make any major changes, and then pursue the things that I know people are going to be looking for me to pursue. And again, it goes back to that strategic priority, right? And looking at it as a commercial imperative. And so I think the fear that you're going to mess it up and it could impair your legacy has been a big reason that we haven't seen more forward motion over the last 30 years that we've been having this conversation. But I could not agree with Mike more that proximity is the thing that is the most powerful antidote, I would say, to destroying the fear, because it really is the fear, as you pointed out before, of the unknown. You're frankly ignorant about the other person. You don't know. And
Right.
as people, as Black people in particular, we probably have the best skills with respect to getting along with people that we don't know, because we have been forced into those positions for a long time. So drop us in a group of Korean people, drop us into a group of Chinese people, drop us into a group of Latinx, drop us into a group of white folks. We're fine. We'll figure it out. We'll get along. We'll find something to say, right? So we don't have the same level of discomfort. But, people in other cultures, if they have thrown into a position where they're the only one, that is a foreign position for them. So the fear overtakes the courage to step out and move forward. So I think by having situations where you can create that proximity, i.e. having diverse teams as a mandate, no matter what, whether it's at the senior management level or whether it's at the production or the shop floor level, that kind of proximity will create some kind of relationship building, some knowledge at a basic level, just respect for the difference, right? And if you're lucky, that's the low case. But if you're lucky, you get great relationships and better collaboration and better productivity. So you can mandate it, but if you have to mandate it in the beginning, just mandate it. But you got to get people close enough so they're not scared. They're not scared of each other.
Butch.
Go ahead.
But the other element as it relates to fear is, and we've seen this often play out, the fear of giving someone Black a shot because of the perception that failure will be public and hurt your brand. I've seen that play out a lot, and so there's fear of needing to cover all of the bases and cross all of the T's, because the predisposition is a shot means risk. But with other people, male who may look like the person who's predominantly in charge, a shot means giving someone an opportunity. And that disparity between those two situations right there creates why it takes 5 years longer to reach the CEO level or to reach the C-suite level for someone Black than it does white, even though people are in the environment, because of fear of giving them an opportunity because of the perceived risk.
And the reality of it is,
my father,
you have risk with anybody, no matter who you choose. There's always risk.
There's always a risk.
But I think Mike's point about your predisposition is something that every leader needs to check.
Right.
My father used to say to me, he said, Butch, white men are the only people in the world who can fail forward. I said, and what he meant was, he said, listen, you hear this all the time in the boardroom. They start talking about people for positions. They go, I think we could stretch. I think he can stretch for this guy. This guy, if we put him in there, we can stretch for him. And if it works, they look like geniuses. If it doesn't work, they simply replace him with another person who looks like him to do the position. But what happens for Black folks when they get a position is that person has to be able to walk across water, be backwards in a moonwalk,
right?
Have gone to 9 different Ivy League schools, have been a PhD and what have you, or they have to check 90 different boxes. And God forbid that person doesn't work out. You're now accountable, and he's now accountable, or she's now accountable for every other Black person. Because we tried that experiment once. That did not work. We need to stay away from that, what have you.
And Butch, where that plays out too is that even at the board level, with the research that we've done, Black board members are the highest recycled board members of any other race and gender, meaning that there are more Black people on multiple boards than any other group. So it's like once you get allowed to get into the bubble, we will lean on Butch or Mike or Carla for the other three versus look at 6 other people like us as potential opportunities. And so that's something that's another fear-based, risk-averse perspective that we see happening all around us.
No question. Let me go to stay with equity for a minute, but I want to use equity in the context of financial, because this is another area, Carla, you touched at the very beginning, that Black folks have had challenges with even wanting to ask for what's equitable. We've almost accepted a status that says, well, I'm just happy to be here. I don't necessarily want to ask for what exactly I should be getting or what have you, because I don't want to stir the pot too much. Now, equity can mean pay equity, it can mean, job equity, what have you, but equity as it relates to wealth building, because this is something that we focus on. The greatest divide we have in this country is not the digital divide, it's not the health divide, not the insurance divide, or an education or whatever the divide may be. It's the wealth divide. If we can close the wealth gap in this country, right, between white and Black, which at the current moment is 10 times that. Whites have 10 times the wealth of Black families. The average white family, average Black family. If we can close that wealth gap, we can get to it. But talk about equity. And when I say talk about equity in terms of financial equity, what Black folks must do to gain equity. Mm-hmm. And to use your word, Mike, which I hate that word when people say, corporations go, we're going to do some financial literacy for the Black community. We have these programs, we're doing these financial literacy. I said, I don't need any financial literacy. I need financial empowerment. I need you to empower me. Don't literate me. I can read and write. If you want to help me, empower me. Don't tell me you're going to give me financial literacy. Now, I've thrown a whole lot to you all, but in our remaining couple of minutes, if you could, address the word equity, but address it equity as it relates to financial equity. What must we demand? What we ask for? How do we help to close this wealth gap and bring equity in all versions, all definitions of equity together?
Mike, you want to start?
Well, let me just say this because I want to hear Carla, what you have to say just as much as everybody else does. So let me get my answer out of the way first. One of the biggest sort of educational opportunities for me, Butch, was when I left corporate America to join a small boutique company that I ended up buying with some partners, with a private equity partner, and then sold it to Korn Ferry 9 years ago. And one of the things that at my growing up Detroit self, I was always targeting on income and salary as the metric that I was always aspiring to get after. And I never really thought about the compound version of equity in something that had value as an element of compensation until then. And I've never advised any young person to work for a big corporation for 30 years as their only decision either, given the returns that you can get when you're more equity oriented. I think the opportunity for us as a community is to be educated around the value of equity and investments as just as important as cash is early in our lives relative to savings and investing in stocks and in businesses. It's not talked about often as something we think about. And getting back to the point that you led with, because of that, there is an imbalance between how many of us even perceive what our value is within an organization. And so we tend to lowball anything when we're asking for something because of the preoccupation with being perceived as, too needy or too dependent. And I'm telling you, it makes my skin crawl when someone who's making $12 million a year in total comp is telling me I'm too interested in money. And so I think at some point we just need to be more collaborative with each other around encouraging investments and inheritance passing down to our family. It's one of the things I really the level of adulation, I would say, relative to your story in terms of the asset that's been generationally sort of preserved, sort of represents the epitome of what more of us should be doing versus this fixated on money only. But it's the more we know about it, the more we can demand it. The more we demand it, it'll happen more often.
Okay, so I'll pick up this baton for Mike because I know we have 2 minutes left. So I could not agree more with what Mike has said, and let me underscore what he just spoke to, and that was about financial literacy, Butch. So I hear what you're saying, that you don't want it, but as you could hear from Mike's background, my background, I still think there are a lot of us out there who really don't understand things like the value of equity and not only how to ask for what we're worth and how to actually invest alongside of whatever we're making on that W-2. So I do still think that there's information and education that needs to happen if we're going to build real wealth. That's number one. Number two, access to capital, which is part of my mantra as we talk about on my podcast, access and opportunity. Women of color and women in general get 1 to 2% of the traditional VC dollars, right? And you really need to make sure that if you're going to be an entrepreneur, that you have access to capital in order to scale your business. And if you can scale your business, not only do you create wealth for yourself, but you can create wealth for all those folks who are working with you that also invested in your business. And those first few people that came along with you that got equity in your business, that's a real easy way to create wealth. But again, you got to know what to do with it, and you got to have access to capital. And that's something, as you know, collectively, all three of us are working on in our own way. And then the last piece is know your worth. To Mike's point, we don't often ask for what we are worth, and many times because we don't know what we are worth. And 20 years ago, it was very difficult to find out the market value of any seat. But today, it's easy to figure out the market value of the seat. There are too many public sources, salary.com, mercer.com, you pick it, where you can orders.
I'm going to ask you guys to give a last word, if you would, on this journey, this diversity, equity. I'm going to put equity in caps, and inclusion journey. And, you have a whole group of the next generation who has done all the things, the right things. Not that we didn't do the right things, but they have a different set of expectations than perhaps we did. We went into something almost expecting to be one of the few. And Carla, you said it before, like, didn't even throw us off. We go into a thing and say, listen, or I said to a group of executives last week, white executive, I said, you could go and spend an entire week and never have to interact with someone that doesn't look just like you. I said, the only option for me to do that is to stay inside my house and never leave. Because once I leave there, I'm now going to be in the minority generally and have learned to navigate. That's a point of strength, though, as far as I'm concerned, because just as you said, we can be dropped into almost any group, anywhere, and navigate because we know how to do it. But give a piece of encouragement, if you would, to this younger group of folks who's going to be watching this Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Summit 2 on how they can use equity to build something for themselves, build something for their families, and to be able to do it in a way that enriches the company, enriches the corporation, at the same time doing something good for themselves as well. Mike, quickly.
Well, I would say for those, recognize that being technically really, really proficient isn't enough. And to be able to create wonderful relationships outside of your network and demonstrate influential skills is critical. Second, take risks. You don't know if you don't try, even if someone tells you you shouldn't. And lastly, recognize that you are going to make mistakes, leverage them, and not be afraid to make them. I guess, and fourth is to invest as early as you can in life, because for a couple of dollars a week, when you're really, really young, can turn into a lot of money if you think about it long term versus waiting until you're in your 50s and 60s to do it.
And I'll just add on to Mike's encouragement. And the one thing I'll add on is, remember, your voice is at the heart of your power. Now is a time where people are asking for your voice. They're asking for your opinion. They're asking for you to innovate. They're asking for your thoughts. Please, please exercise your voice. Do use it. Talk to people about what would make the environment better for you, what would make it more equitable for you, the opportunities that you want. Speak to them. Don't wait for somebody to tap you on the shoulder. You should say, boy, I've done these five things. I'm really good at these 5 things. I'd like to leverage that into that opportunity to create more value for the company. That's your script. But say it. Don't wait.
Carla and Michael, thank you for your pearls of wisdom, for honoring us today with, I saw your pearls, but all of your pearls of wisdom. It means a great deal to the Black Enterprise audience. And I appreciate your leadership in this diversity, equity, inclusion journey as we're on. And we're still a long ways away from where we need to be in terms of parity, but I think that if we fight on and continue to believe in each other and help one another, right? And make sure that we are reaching out to help one another along the path, we're going to all do great in the end. So again, thank you, Carla. Thank you, Michael. Look forward to talking to you all soon.
Thanks for
Thank you,
having me.
Butch.
Bye-bye.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.